So I used to be very pessimistic about sort of the new dystopian reality of digital speech. And after reading this report, I'm even more pessimistic. Hard to believe. So what is that the report is about? And let me quickly in this slide flag what is it about. And actually, I highly recommend it because it provides an up-to-date, very strong, solid summary on what are the main themes in the discussions around hate speech online. I think it's one of the questions is of hate speech beyond terrorism and violent extremism, so beyond the issues that were just discussed in relation to the other report. In my mind, one of the key issues here is the new reality of collapse and multi-layer gatekeeping and the mainstreaming of hate speech. This is, to me, is the new reality in which we live in. The multiple jurisdictions that need to be examined from public to private in which hate speech happens, and the responses and reactions. What works to address the challenges of hate speech to democracy, public life, and free speech? So let me go one by one here. I think is the ease of access to public platforms largely explains sort of the breakdown of gatekeeping and the mainstream of hate speech. Hate speech right now is not something that is relegated to the margins of public communication or public speech, but it has a very healthy, lively existence in many pockets of public communication, particularly online. And this is a result of many developments. Political leaders and Twitter actually cue in different forms of hate speech, right? And there is some ongoing research around this, particularly around populist leaders, how they use Twitter in order to sort of trigger sort of discourse, in order to reinforce different tropes around hate speech. Online harassment networks, which I assume all of you are familiar with, and the existence of individual trolls or actual collective experiences, movements around this, sort of promoting hate speech. So this is sort of takes presence in both everyday hate speech as quote-unquote individual forums, as well as deliberate campaigns and organizations. And also something that Kate mentioned, which is the role of social media in giving a platform to hate speech. It seems to me that under this condition, it's extremely difficult to remain sort of optimistic about the digital revolution, given the massive presence of hate speech. And the report actually does a very good job documenting this sort of how the extent of this phenomenon, as well as fleshing out different understandings of what hate speech is and how sort of the conditions and the definitions vary across countries. One particularly important issue is the question of multiple jurisdictions in which online hate speech happens and who is responsible for it. Social media and many digital platforms are actually hybrid spaces that are both public and commercial. So that poses a challenge for how to address, how to respond to hate speech. And a critical issue, which the report flags, and a number of recent studies have talked about this, the tremendous power of digital giants, IPS, social media, and Google around this. These have become de facto the dominant gatekeepers for much of what is public speech. And one of the real challenges here is that they have tremendous amount of autonomy and secrecy in the way that they manage, sort of the way that they filter, the way they determine what is hate speech. No need to say here that hate speech is a very contested notion. There are multiple ways of thinking about this. And the consequence of different forms of hate speech, whether it's just an individual expression or an incitement to violence by mobilizing speech, there are different ways of thinking about this. And these companies basically have had a reactive position, as a self-corrective position. They react when the problem starts or under pressure. And basically what they try to do is to correct certain ways in which they determined what speech to let in and what to leave out. But in my mind, that's insufficient. And what really the public and government should demand is a more proactive actions and actually become true champions of actions against speech, rather than remaining basically in a very reactive position. But this has to do with the overall conception that these companies have about themselves and why they still try to stay away from being defined, understood as content providers or information companies. The report also mentions, doesn't go in depth because this will be sort of a very different report, of the weight of national regulatory traditions and cultural understandings of speech in policing and regulation. So there's a broad sort of cases in which sort of how different publics and authorities react versus this. In my mind, one of the key challenges of hate speech is not new, no need to say this again here. But the problem is that the endless succession of personal and public attacks on different groups by haters has the effect of poisoning the well of public discourse in ways that becomes much more difficult to control, to patrol, to monitor, and to report this. So the big question implicit in this report is, can hate speech be regulated, and what kinds of regulations are possible? After reading the report, what came to my mind, it was not a literary reference or a musical reference, but it was a reference from the world of arcade games. This situation resembles whack-a-mole. I don't know how many of you are familiar with arcade games. Whack-a-mole is a problem shows up, you address it, and then 2 or 3 more show up, and you spend all the time trying to address this. And it seems to me that we are in a situation right now in which this constant sort of individual or campaigns forms of hate speech pose these constant challenges of how to address a constant moving, dynamic problem. And in some ways, that what typically happens is a reaction to when a specific case, as opposed as sort of the phenomenon itself happens. So hate speech is everywhere on the internet. There are individual trollers and organized hate speech campaigns. There are blurred boundaries between what is an individual act of hate speech versus what is a collective act. When is it that individual expression of hate speech is actually a reflection of group identities, coordinated actions, or when actual forms of individual hate speech are triggered by public speech by political elites? And this is particularly troubling, worrisome, in the context in which the free speech tradition has been hijacked by the right, at least in the countries that I know better. And sort of the tolerance, the promotion, the endorsement of hate speech in the name of free speech coming from the right. So this is, to me, what one of the particular challenges for all of us who are interested in free speech and freedom of information is. And finally, the report talks about effective actions, what to do, what works. So they list a number of actions: monitoring and reporting cases of hate speech, put pressure on digital corporations, mobilize civil society and everyday actions to denounce, correct hate speech, campaigns against advertisers that are supporting actually platforms, so-called, that basically perpetuate hate speech. Media literacy, of course, has a role to play on this, as Divina mentioned, and the need to have both targeted plus local and global interventions and responses. And this, to me, is where the challenge actually is. To me, what I left the report by sort of thinking about the scope, the size of the challenge, and what can be done around this. And in my mind, and this reinforces my sort of pessimism about this situation, is that typically what I think what happens is we, those who sort of denounce hate speech, bring a spoon to a knife fight, bring a knife to a gunfight. You can tell I've been in many fights. I've been in academia for 25 years. So, but the question is how sort of powering the presence of hate speech is, which actually is what this report actually documents. And what can be done, at least for us from academia and engagement with non-academic actors, is to figure out what kinds of actions work across issues different forms of hate speech, as well as countries. What resources are helpful to achieve multiple goals, particularly given the size and the power of the phenomenon that we are encountering? I highly recommend everybody to read this report. It provides sort of a great panoramic view of where we stand and many more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Silvio Baseboard. So we have also now another respondent, another discussant on the same publication. We're in the second publication now. We've finished with Davina's. We're in the hate speech publication, Countering Hate Speech. So I really thank Ghulam Kibiani from Goldsmiths to give his comments.
Thank you. Well, I would like to echo colleagues' thanks to Guy, of course, Davina, and UNESCO, as well as kind of in ways suggest, as others have done. Actually, this is a really, really timely intervention, quite important and significant, and hopefully will change the terms of the debates that we are having at the moment, certainly in Europe, but also hopefully globally. I think the kind of in way issues quite itself really needs that much of a kind of in way explanation of why we're having this debate. I mean, quite clearly, the issues of the hate speech online at the moment as we speak reveals a rather apparent and obvious paradox in contemporary political and cultural sensibilities that afflicts many societies. In recent times, on the one hand, we had kind of in a way growing and expanding sense of everybody in the current climate deserves to have a voice, and we have seen that in some amazing, exhilarating and inspiring social movements across the globe in which actually they use internet for the kind of in a way progressive purposes, but also the case of the hate speech in contrast to that kind of in a way shows that there is a darker side to the internet, and that the proliferation of voices on its own doesn't really kind of in a way makes a step to a greater freedom as we speak. So there is a kind of in a way significant issues. I mean, that paradox, I don't think it's new. Some people have referred to it historically as a kind of in a way perils of democracy. Every technology, every steps, every new situation that brings itself kind of bring to the fore kind of in a way significant problems and issues. I think in the case of the UNESCO document, Silvio excellently kind of in a way summarized the key arguments there, so I'm not going to repeat it there. But at the heart of it, I think there is a kind of in a way important point which is being made again and again and again and again about how to tackle a speech, hate speech online in such a way that it doesn't really threat our right to free speech, our right to discussions, our right to arguments, and in particular kind of in a way fundamental political rights that we all think we enjoy or should enjoy. Since I haven't got that much time, I'm just going to limit my kind of in a way comments to a few areas which caught my eyes. I think the first one, and by far as the report indicates, one of the most kind of in a way contentious area is the issues of the definition. Yes, as the report rightly suggests that the term itself is a very elusive one, and that has been used for various regressive and repressive purposes in recent times by different agencies. The definition that is provided there is this: expression that advocates incitement to harm, particularly discrimination, hostility or violence based upon the targets being identified with certain social or demographic groups. And on the same page, they also add kind of in a way hate speech can be identified by approximation through degrading or dehumanizing functions that it serves. And later on, the report also goes to introduce much narrower definition of the hate speech, such as fear speech or dangerous speech. But I feel many of the examples, and actually Sylvia highlighted that, focus kind of in a way examples and cases which revolves around individual kind of in a way as an agent of kind of in a way instigating and promoting hate speech and spreading the message of fear and hate. And in that case, I think actually there are kind of in a way few examples that we can focus on in terms of kind of in a way further clarification. I mean, of course, it's always difficult to identify when a speech becomes a hate speech. Anti-Israeli sentiment, for example, versus anti-Semitism, criticism of Middle Eastern states versus anti-Muslim racism, or criticism of the women commentators or politicians being identified as sexism, and so on and so forth. Such boundaries, of course, always difficult to kind of in a way identify. Additional problems that we have, and in particular reference to the kind of in a way fear speech or dangerous speech, is about the kind of in a way the shift that has taken place, and I think this is something that we need to be aware of in terms of the debate. So, for example, from objective to the subjective, kind of in an attempt to personalize it, and allowing it to move from something tangible and subject to prosecution to anything that gives hurt, offense, or discomfort. In that case, we should kind of in a way ask, perhaps, is there a danger of equating a speech and deed, opinion and fact, attitude and act? How do we kind of in a way separate and identify them? And what will happen if, for example, our concern and activities around, let's say, anti-racism and gender equality shifts from the concepts relating to fairness, equality and justice to an exercise in purging people's minds of so-called impure thoughts, and indeed purging such people from social media altogether. That is something that states are really, really keen to do. What is also becoming blurred, and I think the report also implicitly refers to that, under pressure from various national and sectional interests, is the line between what is illegal and what is unpleasant, between what should be punished or outlawed, and what can be formally, informally dealt with through, let's say, education. So that's one of the kind of in a way points which I think is kind of in a way quite important to extend and perhaps have further debates. The second point I wanted to make, and already there has been some references to that by other speakers, is to kind of in a way to do with the question of a state. There are some references to political organizations, including governments, throughout the report. But my general kind of in a way feeling was the role of the estates is rather on the plate in the report altogether. Only in the conclusion, important questions about economic inequalities and hate speech or access to education and social resources are mentioned, or the fact that they mention kind of in a way state being defined as a kind of in a way a holder, or the kind of in a way having the monopoly over legitimate violence. And a state in part of the report is mentioned as a regulator. We've heard that and report is kind of in a way quite careful, not leaning, in my view, quite rightly, towards further restrictions on free speech. And I completely agree with that when it says responding to hate speech cannot be easily addressed simply by relying upon a state power. That would be completely kind of in a way counterproductive. But the problem in my view is not as much as the report indicates or states, and this is a quote, identifying and prosecuting all individuals posting harmful messages would be impractical for most estates. Again, the assumption here is actually the kind of in a way hate speech and degrading activities takes place by the individual, and the state emerges as kind of as a regulator, as something which can address these kind of in a way issues. So the state becomes the kind of in a way really the guardian of the kind of in a way morality and norms and so on and so forth. I think there is a different way of putting this, and it is not, in my view, merely individuals that are spreading hate, fear, and dangerous messages. I would even go as far as suggesting much of the problem, as actually Robin indicated, actually comes from above. It's not kind of in a way just the individual problems. Problems of discrimination are not a matter of individual prejudices and literacy, although that might be the case, but generally speaking, state policies. The history of many things which worries us, racism, history of sexism, history of homophobia, and so on, is effectively the histories of state policies on those matter. And some of the hate speeches that are actually making many of us sick in the stomach are indeed have electoral legitimacy backed by the state violence. Just look at the speeches by Donald Trump, as Silvio actually kind of in a way referred to it. Or kind of in a way look at the rapid increase in racial violence in Britain after Brexit. Even on a kind of in a way much lower level, let's look at Macron's speech last week about the roots of African problem, kind of in a way highlighting the what kind of in a way called hypersexual activities of African, which has been one of the kind of in a way central elements of much of the kind of in a way racist and stereotypical images about Africa. And you could easily argue, are these not fear speech and dangerous speech? Do they not set the tone and terms of the debate? Do they not give political legitimacy to hate speech? And if Trump can get away with what he calls boys' locker room talk, then why not other people? The point I want to make is this. If there is a need for education, then the state should be the first in the classroom. It is actually the other way around. It's a state that needs education and to be educated. The third point I wanted to make is kind of in a way, and it's linked to the above, and I think it's rather absent, a crucial kind of in a way category, is the role of the mainstream media in promoting and amplifying the messages of hate, fear, and ultimately violence. On page 36 of the report, we read this. This study does not extensively look at the role of the news media in regards to hate speech, given the reportage of such a speech generally does not amount to advocacy of incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, but it is in the service of the public interest. I think this is a rather sweeping statement, and I actually beg to differ. Where exactly news media in general or in the coverage of hate speech are in the service of the public interest? Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Zimbabwe, China, Russia, Hungary, Poland, and so on and so forth. The media, kind of with this image of the media as a servants of the public interest, really, really applies to a very, very, very small section of the media. Even in liberal democracies, we have a visible example in which the news media acts not in the public interest, but actively encourages discrimination and hostility. British tabloids are a significant and clear example in that sense, and various studies actually have confirmed this. Indeed, as many researchers actually have shown in recent times, the role of the large section of the British press was quite crucial in misinforming the public prior to the European referendum, which was noticeable for its highly xenophobic coverage with absolutely deadly consequences. And similarly, we're looking at the coverage of the refugee crisis across a number of countries, they have been nothing but absolutely dangerous and hostile. And I think neglecting this dynamic allows for the mainstream messengers of hate to get away simply because they can and because they have a power. So if there is, I'm going to finish with this. I think the crucial point is really breaking out of that frame around terrorism, around hate speech, around securities and so on and so forth, which is really framed by the state and the political establishment and bring something new to the table.
Thank you so much, Golan. So we're going to move now to our third publication, and time is a bit tight because we've got 2 comments on this third publication, then we have a comment on the last publication. We've got 15 minutes, but we can push it a little bit. So let me ask Manisha Pathak Shelat, first of all, to tell us the publication that she is going to be commenting on is this Media and Information Literacy publication, Reinforcing Human Rights, Countering Radicalization and Extremism. This is the one I showed earlier. I'll tweet out the link, but if you want to look for it on a search engine, UNESCO Media and Information Literacy, Reinforcing Human Rights, Countering Radicalization and Extremism.
Thanks, Guy, and thank you, UNESCO, for this invitation. It not only gives me opportunity to engage in this very timely discussion, but it also gave me a chance to substantially engage with this really rich and relevant collection of research studies from all over the world. So I'll just introduce the necessity for media and information literacy research in context of human rights and radicalization, because the increasing radicalization has brought us different responses, and especially we could categorize them in 2 sets of responses. The first is a fear response resulting in bans and the whole security discourse, limits on freedom of expression on one side, but there is also a second set of responses which focuses on education and sensitization. And media and information literacy belongs to the second set of responses. It focuses on empowerment, sensitization, well-being, and revolves around the questions of identity, agency, participating in social change, and engaging with the world. So for those in the audience whose work does not focus on media and information literacy, I would just like to give a quick overview. That this field has evolved substantially over the years. The major work started in the late 70s and early 80s, and initially the focus was on protecting children from harmful media content, and that is when the critical skills became very important in media and information literacy. We then moved on to cultural and creative skills, and we realized that you cannot be called literate if you can only read and not write. Similarly, a media literate person also has to know how to produce and not just receive. And that is when production became an important part of this field. Then later in the 2000s, we have the civic turn, when the issues of social change and agency became important. And there is more and more focus looking at the globalized world, on intercultural dialogue and the inclusion of social media. And in 2011, we have information literacy and digital skills as part of this field. Throughout this time, there have been celebratory and risk discourses about the role of media, especially in young people's lives, and that's why there is a really huge need of research to, sort of restrain these extreme discourses. And what this collection does, I pointed out this overview to you because it's not that now that we have moved to information and digital literacy, the work of early years is not important. And this collection clearly reflects all these trends over the years: critical skills, production, intercultural dialogue, and digital literacies in this collection. So, studying the essays and research reports and studies in this collection, I saw several positive things. The media and information literacy research has now truly become global. It is diverse, and it is also very reflexive. This collection focuses on human rights, countering radicalization and extremism. And the studies are divided in 4 major sections. There are studies on community empowerment and sustainable development, hate speech and incitement, radicalization and extremism, gender equality. So I'm glad, Divina, that what you pointed out was really true, but this collection at least has some studies on gender, which is a very good sign, and many studies on intercultural and interreligious media discourses. Now, what I observed is that, and again, much of what I said would also reflect what Divina's study observed, is that there is yet very little work on radicalization and extremism. Media and information literacy research is still concerned more with the associated areas. And they also work more in the area of human rights and intercultural dialogue, but there is very little actual research on extreme radicalization or violent extremism. So let me first tell you about some of the research accomplishments in this field, and that is clearly evident in this collection. So I think media and information literacy researchers all over the world do certain things really well. One is that they really do situated, context-sensitive, small studies. And most of these studies are focused on pedagogic practices. And these practices are aimed at developing certain competencies in media and information literacy. So if I could divide the research in this collection, I could see like 4 major areas. There are intervention studies. So these are case studies. And again, one very heartening direction is that earlier, most of the intervention studies were based in the classroom, in formal education. But this collection shows that more and more, the community and online sites and social media are recognized as valid sites for intervention, for human rights, and for countering extremism. So there are case studies from all over the world. The second category is of how do you inculcate values and competencies in young people that are necessary for countering radicalization. So again, small, with a group of university students, with group of school students, with women farmers. But these studies actually focus on values like democracy, tolerance, participation, and how these strategies are really effective. The third category is critical analysis of media representation, which has always remained a very important part of media and information literacy, and studying the audience experience of these kind of media representations. So many of the research in this collection focuses on how media uh, propagate stereotypes, or there is bias in a representation of certain groups, or how certain groups which have no empowerment or no access to media, how they are not represented at all in the media discourses. And finally, there are some studies that focus on designing and evaluating strategies for counter-narratives. So two things become important. One is analyzing the existing narratives, and then second is that how to produce counter-narratives and whether these counter-narratives are really effective. So after I looked at the collection, these are some of the gaps and questions and challenges which really emerged. What I found that there are two really important missing populations. There are barely any studies on out-of-school youth and those already radicalized. I mean, they don't figure at all. Usually there is also a third group missing, that is youth from Global South, but I must say that this collection has several research studies from countries of Global South, and so that group is well represented. So that is one thing we'll really have to address, because there is a higher probability of radicalization and extremism in the youth which is not undergoing formal education. There are barely any large-scale impact studies to generate evidence for policy formulation. Neither are there quantitative estimates, which would give us an idea of the larger or broader trends. And I agree with Robin that we don't have to fall in the trap of, always producing hardcore evidence. But there will have to be something which, as Divina's study does, brings together evidences from small context-based studies and give us a larger picture. And I don't say this is easy, because I myself do very context-sensitive ethnographic studies, and I'm often at a loss when somebody says that now you have to scale this up, because there are challenges, and often it is not even desirable to blindly scale up studies which work in certain context and don't work in certain context. Also, a lot of the conclusions in the collection talks about like the should, and they say that media literacy has this potential, but there is still little empirical evidence about the long-term pros and cons of initiatives to produce counter narratives. So we really don't know for sure what works and what kind of counter narratives would backfire. Also, we need methodological innovations for cross-country examination and longitudinal studies. So these are some of the gaps that I found in the collection. I was going to talk a little bit about some research that I'm doing in this area, but I'm going to skip that for now and talk about some of the future directions. Guy, do I have a couple of minutes? 2 minutes? Yeah, that's great. So again, some of this really reflect what Divina's conclusions say. We need more studies in media and literacy, and it's not exactly media and information literacy area, but unless we know the actual extent, spread, and intensity of digital radicalization, unless we know who are the most influential and who are the most vulnerable, and what are the processes and spaces that are involved in extremism and radicalization, we cannot really design media and information literacy interventions. There is also more need of generating qualitative as well as quantitative evidence to inform not only pedagogy, because there is a lot of excellent research work going on about the media and information literacy pedagogy, but not enough yet on policy. So that is one area that we really need to address. Meta-analysis, I think, is one important need, because whatever we say, finally at the end of the day, the industry, the policy, the school would ask us about some broad conclusions or some general guidelines or indications. And that's, again, the kind of study that Divina reported in the beginning. I think those kind of studies would become more and more important. And we need to work on a more polycentric research rather than Eurocentric research that had been going on all these years, and have more multidisciplinary, multi-country teams, which can examine together larger initiatives like MOOCs or global civic websites, like the Global Voices Online or UNICEF Voices of Youth. Also, I think we'll have to bring to the stage more voices from Global South in the media and information literacy research. So in conclusion, I endorse the study conclusion that the UNESCO 2017 study announced, that we need more explicitly theorized and evidence-based results concerning both radicalization processes online, and I would add here that there are links with the offline processes and the outcomes of online prevention and policy measures. And the second very important initiative, I would think, is that we have to disseminate these findings outside academia, and that has not been done enough, so that, there is not this extreme celebratory or risk discourses, though in the right measures, both are very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manisha. And now we have Abiodun Salawu with some comments on the same study, and then we go to Megan Knight for the final wrap-up. So please bear with us another 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Guy, and thanks also to UNESCO, as other speakers have said. I will just make some brief comment about the issue contained in the book Media and Information Literacy concerning violent extremism, radicalization, and all that. Yeah, I think all the speakers who have spoken earlier have reiterated the fact that there is really not much causality between social media, internet, and radicalization, social extremism. And based on that, I would think that media and information literacy, would just be one of the things, that can be done to eradicate radicalization and extremism. Because, if we assume that by doing that, we will be able to substantially eradicate radicalization, it will mean that we are overlooking some other issues that are also very important. We need to also consider some socialization issues. Most of the people who obtain information from social media, from internet, and believe, in what they see there, they do that because it conforms to what they already believe in. And that is why, socialization is very important. Socialization from home, from religious organizations, and others. So the issue of ethics and morality, even for our children, is very important, because it is what they already believe in that the media is only reinforcing. Is only reinforcing in them. And I know that even UNESCO, in this publication that we are talking about, realizes this and also acknowledges it. And that's why, it says on page 15 of that publication that we are talking about, it says that the UNESCO's contribution to preventing violent extremism is rooted in the United Nations Plan of Action to prevent violent extremism. The latter covers issues such as education, skill building and employment, youth empowerment, internet and social media, communication and gender equality, and women's empowerment. Yeah. So these are all sociological issues that will aid extremism. Unemployment is there among the youth. Many of them, do not have jobs to do. So when, when they are cajoled by the jihadists or by any extremist organization, and they are cajoled into believing that they will cater to their needs, they will look after them, they will jump into it. Yeah, and there is little the media can do about that, because the sociological issues prevalent do not help them to be able to counter such propaganda from the extremist groups. And again, when we look at the psychocultural theory, it talks about the issue of ethnic origin as being one of the most important explanations for violent extremism, for violent conflict. And this, to this, we can also add, issue of religion, issue of racism. Yeah, these are serious issues. For instance, in South Africa, the issue of age is about racism. It surrounds the issue of racism. You are white and black and all that. In Nigeria, it will be about ethnicity. Okay, you are Hausa, you are Yoruba, you are Igbo. And this is also sometimes intertwined with religion. And these are difficult issues, and these are emotive issues that can trigger conflict and that can make people to take a particular stand that appears to be extreme. Yeah, so these are some of the issues that I believe are also intertwined. Not just the media. The media have their role to play, no doubt about it. But beyond that, there are other issues that could also be addressed, or that we could also identify as contributing factors to all this problem. Okay. I will also. Okay, thanks so much. Okay. Yeah, I will also want to say that. Sorry, please. I made some notes here. Yeah, I will also want to say that if the media, would attempt to help us, in moderating this extremism and all that, sometimes, their actions, or rather the steps that they will take, could tantamount to infringement on human rights. For instance, I know that there are some online newspapers, that moderate what people put online. Readers' comments. I'm somebody, I'm very much interested, in reading readers' comments when I read news stories online. And sometimes, you discover that some online newspapers, they have a policy of moderating what is put in the air, what is put online. And in doing so, some readers complain that, why are you gagging me? Okay? Why are you suppressing what I'm saying? Why don't you do it, to this person who said this and all that? So these are some of the issues that is even beyond the media. I do know about one particular online newspaper that has actually stopped doing that. They have stopped, readers from making comments. So it's not possible for readers to make any comment when they read any story. So we might say, oh, this is suppressing freedom of expression and all that. But these are some of the problems that the media themselves, are facing in even curtailing what the people say. I agree with the notion that people need to be educated about the way the media works, and I also want to believe that even without saying it, the people themselves know, about, or rather, let me say, some people know, the operations of the media. At times when I read readers' comments to news stories online, the kind of things that people say tells me that they also are aware, of certain things happening in the media. They understand, the notion of ownership, how it affects, what a particular medium will put out, and all that. So they have some of this knowledge, but beyond that, their primordial interest, would override some of these things, and they want to take, some stands that are quite extreme. So all the same, we need to let the audience know that there is no text without a pretext. I was reading something yesterday that a guy put on Twitter, a Twitter that he put, and he was reporting what a colleague, Mehita, said, in one of the sessions, that there's no text without pretext, and there's no text, without context. So some of we need, to educate, our media users to understand this important fact that it is not everything that you read, in the media that you should take, as something important or something that is sacrosanct. Okay, and I'm also, of the belief that anonymity is a big problem in media use, in the way people, the kind of things that people put online, hate speech and all that, because they can hide under anonymity. Nobody knows who says what, so they can do a lot of trolling, a lot of flaming, okay, using fake names, and all that. So I do not know what the internet providers, okay, what they can do, okay, to be able to open the mask, to be able to let us know the people who are behind certain speeches that are put online. So that will greatly help if we can actually identify people who are behind such speeches. And I should also want to say that this effort of UNESCO is quite commendable. UNESCO, is not, isolated in this. It's not the only one doing that. A colleague there, spoke about Vox Pol, which is a European Framework 7 program. I was part of it, the inaugural conference that they had in 2014 August. I was part of it. And I do know there are some other efforts being made. I'm aware of the EU Internet Forum, okay, which also has some program of educating people about internet, okay, about internet, the use of internet. And they try to take this thing to the grassroots, not just, in the ivory tower, in the academia, They try to take it, even to the people on the street for them to understand. And how do they do that? They have a program, which they call Civil Society Empowerment Program, okay, by which, they want to give support to civil societies, to grassroots organizations, and to credible voices, so that people can be educated about online extremism, radicalization, and all that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abirdan. So we move on to the last publication. I'm sorry for cutting you a bit short, Anisha, but actually we're back on track. So if Megan can speak her comments on the last publication, which is a handbook for journalists covering terrorism, and then we've got some time for a bit of discussion.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I can't shake the feeling that I should stand up and give a PowerPoint and then sit down and comment on my own PowerPoint, but I'm not going to do that. So, so this is the handbook on terrorism in the media. Actually, I think it's a bit easier for me to control. This is a handbook on terrorism in the media, and it's a very useful handbook. But it is, unlike some of the other work we've looked at today, it is not primarily the subject, the product of academic research, but the product of best practice and analysis of how journalists should work. So it's a much more simple and more straightforward publication, much less complex and I think much less problematized than the other ones. There are a couple of key themes which I think are important though, which need to be highlighted. One is the publication does highlight the question of terrorism and what is a terrorist and what is or isn't a terrorist early on. And I mean, obviously this is a debate that we all know, and we tend to mention it in the first sort of week of journalism school, I think, to our students. It's the classic example of how language alters meaning. It's the classic way you demonstrate framing. However, I don't think that uncertainty as to what terrorism is actually penetrates the rest of the book, which does rather assume that there are specific kinds of acts and specific kind of actors which are automatically and inherently terroristic, and that there is less discussion of the gray areas and the boundaries there. So I think there's some interesting questions here. But that said, the practices, I think, are valid regardless of whether the act is terroristic or criminal or sort of senselessly violent, whether it's a state actor, a parastatal actor, or an individual motivated by a political or religious or cultural or personal agenda. I think so, a lot of the guidelines regarding actual behavior in the time frame is really important. However, I also think there are a few other concerns. So one of the questions that comes up is this issue of speculation or rumor, and the media mustn't work to fuel speculation and rumor. And that's an incredibly hard thing to tell journalists to do. And I think that the market demand and the market concerns that apply to journalists are really, really powerful, and that a handbook that advises journalists on how you deal with and respond to a huge and disturbing event needs to acknowledge that there is going to be pressure on the journalist to report things that will increase traffic and that will increase publicity. I live in the United Kingdom. I'm not British, but I live in the United Kingdom, and in the last couple of months we've had a series of events. We've had 4 major, violent, horrific events in which loss of life was substantial, and I am including the fire at Grenfell Tower Block in that, because from a functional perspective I don't see the reporting of that event as functionally different from the reporting on the attack in Manchester at the concert, or either of the 2 bridge attacks. Britain's got probably the most competitive media environment in the developed world. We have 8 daily newspapers lined up at my train station every morning that I can buy, and 2 additional ones I can pick up for free. And in that climate, the pressure on the journalist to have the most sensationalist story is massive. And this handbook, I don't believe, really is that helpful to a journalist who is fighting that and saying, look, we need to be careful, we need to not speculate, we need to not go with rumor, when the editor is saying, yes, but every other newspaper that we're competing with will. So I think there's an interesting challenge there. There's an example which isn't brought up here, which I think is really telling. There was an attack on Parliament Hill in Ottawa a number of years ago. A man went to Parliament Hill with a gun and shot a couple of people, including a security guard, and was eventually tackled by the Sergeant-at-Arms. And it was a sort of great heroic Canadian story. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation was commended and commented on in a lot of media discussion, because for most of that day, their reporting consisted of, we don't know what is going on. We don't know who this person is. We don't know why he's done this, and we're not going to tell you until we do. And that is to be commended. But the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has an immense amount of privilege in Canada, in that it is very powerfully the only main dominant television media available. So it has the privilege to do that. So I think market forces become really important in this. But I think that there's another interesting one that is raised with the ethics, and the ethics of whether journalists should engage with organizations that are perceived to be terroristic, or perceived to be acting in ways that the state defines as terrorism. And the book is the booklet is very encouraging of journalists to consider their own ethics and to consider that their role is, and I'm going to quote here, one of a journalist's duties is to inform on reality as completely as they can. A fugitive's opinion is part of the reality that citizens have the right to know, so as to understand the phenomenon and judge security policies and mechanisms. And I think that's really, really important to remember, that we as journalists have the right to report on the things that are happening, and the things that are happening and the people that are involved in those things include the people who are causing them to happen.